So, yeah, thanks. It's so easy to forget that. So we'll do the papers in the sequence that appears in the program. So if people want to hear the second paper, they can log in with some time planning. And we'll take, I think, up to 20 minutes, and then we'll have like 10 minutes for discussion and some thoughts. Would that be good? Okay. So the first paper, I'll quickly introduce the authors. It's Lilach, Lurie, who's from the Labor Studies Department in Tel-Aviv University. And I'm Guy Mundlak. I'm from the Labor Studies and from the Faculty of Law in the department in Tel-Aviv University as well. So this is a joint project for which we got funding. And I think that with no further ado, of course, I lost the PowerPoint. So 1 second, I'll just get it up here and we'll start. Okay, can you see that? Okay, so we're gonna split this presentation. So Lilach, why won't you start, and I'll try to keep time and discipline you and myself. The latter part is the hardest one. Okay, so go ahead. I'll put the slides as we move along.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Jeannie, Sean, and Carla. I'm excited to be here, and I'm also looking forward to meet in person again. And yeah, we will present together our the study that we are conducting together, Guy and me. The study is about industrial relations and the COVID-19 crisis in Israel. More specifically, we analyze in the study all collective agreements that were signed in Israel during the crisis. Guy, the next slide.
Yeah.
I would like to start the talk by mentioning a new ILO report, the report which looks at all collective agreements that were signed all around the globe. It highlights the importance of collective agreements as the way to face the crisis. Referencing to Freeman and Madoff, I would say that it looks at the voice side of the unions. To provide several quotes from the report, collective bargaining can play a significant role in forging resilience. Collective bargaining enables the parties to establish arrangements that offer procedural and substantive certainty to both employers and workers. Guy, your turn.
Yeah. The ILO report gives a very rosy picture of collective bargaining, which of course we very much endorse and appreciate, but it seems that there is no conflict there. Sorry, there are no trade-offs. And one thing that we wondered, is it really all that good? There are indications that during the COVID-19, there were a decline in membership rates across many countries, partially because organizing drives were halted, partially because establishments that were traditionally organized had to close down. Where applicable, increase in social bargaining sustained coverage, so coverage was less affected. And this is the kind of thing that we will not be able to test now because Israel has very poor recording of both membership and coverage rates. So we're going to be guessing here. But in other aspects, we want to be a bit more critical in the sense of asking question. If we think about what unions do, then yes, trade unions can improve negotiations and adjustments during the crisis, but they can also be a heavy machinery compared to non-union companies. And we know that unions can have an impact also that on reducing inequality, but also creating inequality when we're talking about core and periphery or insiders and outsiders. To what extent is this an all rosy picture? And to what extent do collective bargaining agreements actually give voice to underprivileged groups, and particularly we think about gender, ethnic, age, disability, which we know from all the recent studies of the last year or two have been disadvantaged during the COVID years. So to what extent is it really a system that enables to see these groups and their challenges? The study that we're doing here and that we're presenting here is only part of the big picture. What we did was we took all the collective agreements signed between March 2020 until the end of 2021. As Lilach will show, it's a record number of collective agreements. So some of the questions we can try to look at from studying these collective agreements. Some need supportive data and some have to be done in a different study. For example, comparing the union and the non-union. Looking only at collective agreements means that we're looking only at the organized establishments and organized sectors with all the limitations of such a study. Israel, why Israel? First of all, because we're in Israel and we're presenting here the study. So, that's why we're doing this. But it's also an interesting laboratory because Israel was highly corporatist. In 1995, dismantled the Gantt system, the mega Gantt system that was in Israel. And what we have now is actually a hybrid system that includes both enterprise bargaining and sectoral bargaining. And this will be particularly evident when we're looking at the public sector that is still bargained at the sector level, meaning for the whole public sector as a whole, give and take, and the private sector, which a lot of it is bargained at the enterprise level. So we're seeing two very different systems of industrial relations. Lilach?
And so we can also see this when we're looking at the number of collective agreements that were signed during the last decades. While during the 70s and 80s, there was many collective agreements, and we can see the sharp decrease in the number of collective agreements that were signed in the last decade. The next slide, Guy. But if we're looking at the last decade, we can also see that 2020 was a special year with an increase in a sharp increase in the number of collective agreements that were signed during the COVID-19 crisis. So there was specifically a lot of collective agreements that were signed during the year 2020. Guy?
Okay. If we see that there's generally more collective agreements during these, we look at 2020 and the same data for 2021, there's a high surge of collective agreements that have been signed. So clearly, COVID period encouraged more collective bargaining, but we want to kind of like get into a higher resolution. And here we see the development of the COVID period of time, the COVID periods, where we have the gray areas are 3 periods of lockdowns, where the first lockdown, which was starting mid-March 2020, is a very strict one, while the third, and then it gradually declines. The third lockdown, which was at the beginning of the 2021, that's the Omicron one, was very, let's say, easy. There was a lot of resistance from the public, and also the limitations were much lesser than in the first. And the blue line is the daily deaths, and the important thing is the purple and red dots, that's the rate of unemployment. So actually there are differences. We cannot talk about the year and a half of the COVID era as a single period of time. Lilach?
Yes, and because if we're looking at the year 2020, we can see that 2 months specifically are interesting. In May, there were a lot of collective agreements that were signed. It's after the first lockdown. And also if we're looking at December, in December, things looked good. There was a thought that this is the beginning of recovery, and there was a specifically high number of collective agreements that were signed this year. Guy, the next slide. And also, if we're looking not only at the number of collective agreements, we also looked at how much of these collective agreements are directly about COVID-19. So we can see that in the first period of the crisis, March, April, May, June, most of the collective agreements that were signed in Israel were directly about the crisis. And then if we're going to December, most of the collective agreements were not directly about the crisis. And Guy, the next slide.
Yeah.
And also in 2021, most of the collective agreements are not directly about the crisis. Okay?
The advantage of being in a small country is that we can actually go and read all of the collective agreements, which is something that would probably be more difficult to manage in the United States. And when we read through the agreements, it's very easy to see that there are indeed differences. May 2020 designate short-term adjustments. They're all about wage cuts or wage freeze or postponement of wage hikes, pre-planned wage hikes, agreements to layoffs. And that's, see that there's the number of layoffs, or we had a furlough arrangement despite attempts to do what's called in Israel the German model of keeping all the workers, or as many workers as possible, even part-time. Then in Israel, they opted for a furlough arrangements and getting workers on unemployment. So all kind of agreements regarding what to do during furlough, use of vacation days and sick days. And what's interesting is that characteristic to these agreements is the idea that even if there are short-term concessions, then the union insisted on preserving contributions to pensions and to the popular midterm saving plans, meaning that anything that has to do with long-term social security should be maintained. If we look at the peak of agreements starting from December 2021 and then moving onwards, then we see suddenly a lot of comprehensive agreements, just like in the years before COVID, wage supplements, sometimes in return for the wages that were deducted, sometimes just a general rearrangement of comp and ben arrangements, dealing with vacation days that workers were suddenly getting into an overdraft because they used their vacation days during COVID, so granting them some more vacation days or allowing them to take some in advance. Some of these agreements are cautious, realizing that we're still not out of the COVID era, and saying all of this is conditional on the development. And some of these are very particular enterprise or sectoral adjustments regarding training or work days. So the two, if we disaggregate, then the different periods of time of COVID reveal very different kind of agreements. Okay, Lilach?
Yes, and back to the ILO report, the ILO found in the collective agreements that were signed all over the globe, 5 main themes that in our study, we found them also in Israel, and we will go over them. Guy, the next slide.
Yeah.
The first theme that was found by the ILO in many countries, and we found it also in Israel, regards adjustments to the renewal and applications of agreements. The next slide.
Yeah.
And the second theme was about protecting frontline workers, sustaining key services. Here we found in Israel a big difference between the public sector and the private sector. While in the public sector, the collective agreements really protected frontline workers, especially healthcare workers, nurses, medical doctors, laboratory workers, and we didn't find the same protection in the private sector. These are initial findings, but we didn't find yet the same amount of protection in the private sector. Guy?
Yeah. I should mention, and do this quickly, that in a separate study, we found that when we interviewed workers' committees or delegates at the workplace level on a particular question, and that was how to deal with the vaccinated and the unvaccinated at the workplace, and what kind of sanctions can be imposed on those who are not vaccinated. There was an interesting question whether the workers' committees wanted to be involved in this question, or whether they preferred for management to deal with this by themselves. One of the workers' committees said, "Why do I need this shit? We learned to cope and deal with the problem cases." We didn't want to get into that. We didn't want to intervene where the workers are split one against the other, but we got into it and we got involved. So there is a whole interesting qualitative sidetrack to this. Lilach, we can move on to the third. I'm getting towards the end, yeah.
I'm moving to the third theme of dialogue. The third theme that we found also in Israel, but again, mostly in the public sector, was about preserving employment. The collective agreements in the public sector were a lot about job security, about preserving employment, protecting their earnings, providing security. Guy, I think.
Yeah, I think that here again, in a separate study that we did, we took a panel survey that started in March 2020, and then we got back to the same panel members every 2 months. And one thing that we found is that indeed those who were in the organized sector, meaning members and covered, enjoyed a much greater employment protection, particularly when compared to what we designate as the outsiders, those who are not members and not covered by collective agreements. But what was interesting is that in terms of wage loss, the wage loss of outsiders who remained on the job was lesser than the wage loss of trade union members who remained on the job, which for us indicated the story that there was a negotiated trade-off, meaning organized workers remained on the job to a much greater extent, but there was a bargaining over wages, allowing employers more flexibility that allowed to keep workers on the job. Lilach?
Theme number 4 of the ILO was about ensuring safe and healthy workplaces. Here again, we found most of the collective agreements regarding ensuring safe and healthy workplaces were in the public sector, less collective agreements in the private sector regarding safe and healthy workplaces. Guy?
Yeah, and the last point, and I think that's also a springboard to the next presentation, and that's about collective agreements and shaping telework. And here the process is that we see that it started in the public sector. And I think that one of the important messages for me that I take from where we are at the study is the importance of sectoral bargaining or social bargaining over the enterprise one. And that's where where we see more innovation at the original position. Somewhat surprisingly, because you would think that in the private sector you will see more experimentation, but actually it's the public sector that is leading here with a centralized agreement on telework in the public sector in November 2021. Starting from May 2020, we see all kind of sporadic enterprise bargaining and agreements, but they're very limited in scope. They touch on one or other topic. I'll show the list in a second. And what we're seeing these days, and it's actually these days over the last couple of months, is a consolidation of the overall public sector agreement with some of the small experiments at the private sector. And these are being now built into sectoral agreements for banks and for insurance. And these agreements touch on mutual consent to work from home with some differences, extent of permissible work from home, how to monitor time, which is a major issue. And also I would add here privacy matters that are going into these agreements, expenses, which means canceling reimbursements at work, such as travel and meals, and compensating for costs at home, or both, and then the residual, which is health and safety, ergonomics, guidance, support, which are built into this. And I think that one of the things that we were asking, and we're starting to see preliminary indications, but we're very hesitant about this, whether we have a canon, some kind of a standard that is emerging regarding homework that is emerging from collective bargaining rather than from legislation. So if I conclude here, we have many collective agreements. We have intensive activity of collective bargaining over the COVID period with adaptation, responsiveness. Who is not included? There is less protection in the private sector. Those outside the organized sector do not have collective voice, obviously, self-employed gig economy. Those who are employed in organized sector but receive lesser protection. And we see delay of tenure. We see postponement of temporary status, meaning those who are still temporary at their workplace remain temporary over the COVID period. Two-tiered collective agreements remain, formal equality to all the employees, and there is no evidence of a particular accommodation for women, for minorities, for the elderly who faced particular or special obstacles in the labor market. And I think that raises one of the questions, is the collective bargaining machinery good for temporary adjustments, as the ILO explained, which is clearly something that happened, or whether there was also here an opportunity for change or more deep structured change and renewal, and we're not sure about how much of that is actually going on. So that's our presentation. And I think we actually, yeah, we're on time. So if you have comments, ideas, things to help us move on with this project, which we'll have to write over the summer, that'll be great. Yeah, Jenny.
I have a not very well-formed question, but just something that occurred to me at the end as you were talking about the temporary adjustments or the opportunity for change and renewal. I mean, if I think about the story you were telling, it's really of unions. A lot of the bargaining was in the context of unemployment and uncertainty, which are situations where unions are losing power, right? And so, or they, you wouldn't expect them to have as high structural power under those conditions. But at the same time, certainly in the US, there were particular conditions that empowered certain groups of workers because there was a high demand for, gig and delivery workers, so they were very visible, and that did encourage some degree of organizing that was new, or a lot of the focus on essential workers and the attempt to make sure to keep them around. That also put some public attention to them that did provide some opportunity for the mobilization or the change and renewal. So I guess my question is, you talk about kind of public versus private, but do you see some differences within your sample, certain sectors maybe that perhaps didn't face the same structural weaknesses, or where labor was trying to use those opportunities, or you think this is more of a kind of across the board story of Israeli labor?
Lilach, do you want to take that, or if you have some thoughts?
No.
I think yes, physicians, nurses, and particularly laboratory workers who are very poorly paid, some of them succeeded in getting some gains. I think the laboratory workers were the ones who were really precious, because they went on strike at the time when they just started the COVID testing, and so they knew how to seize the moment. And I think also the Great Resignation, starting around June 2021, in July, that's when the unemployment funds ended. The extended unemployment funds ended. Also raises question about structural power and market power and what exactly is happening, something which I'm still putting with a big question mark because I'm not sure that I fully comprehend or that I read a fully good account of what's happening and for whom. But these are power games. I mean, clearly some people are changing, but I'm not sure. It's not that they succeeded into getting into new sectoral bargaining that's been in decline because they said, look, for the tourist industry or for the aviation industry, there is really a benefit for getting a sector agreement. It's not that there was a reconsideration of the industrial relations system in the way that, for example, you see in the future of work reports of the OECD or the ILO, where the future is not in organizing at the enterprise level, the future is in social bargaining and sector level bargaining. And while we see the benefits of sector level bargaining for the public service, it's not that there was something here beyond the more minute structural power games of those who lost and those who could get some gains. And I think that this is perhaps where we should try to define what is a deep structural change rather than just things as usual kind of change. And that's something that we need to figure out how to make it, probably for ourselves, how to make such a distinction. Yep, Sean.
Two questions. One, did you notice any surprising variations among the decentralized, the enterprise agreements? So did you notice that maybe there were any unions that surprised you by how good of a collective agreement they negotiated in the midst of a crisis where you saw it getting really bad and you thought, wow, that's a model for how to, resist the pressures associated with the COVID-19 crisis. That would be a model for the enterprise agreements. And then the second question, you guys had mentioned that it was surprising that the public sector was more innovative and that it was sectoral bargaining. And this and I'm just shooting an idea out there. I've done some research in Sweden, and some of the Swedish union folks were telling me that they're highly innovative because of sectoral bargaining, because it empowers them and they feel less scared that they'll use membership. Membership's not necessarily tied to it. The fate of a single company is not tied to what they do. So they feel like they can kind of negotiate some radical stuff and push the envelope in ways that they couldn't if they decentralized. Do you think this has anything to do with the connection between innovation and the public sector that you're seeing, or do you think it's something else?
For variations, first, I don't think we found many, and probably because a lot of the agreements are under the auspices of one major trade union. And so Israel has one dominant kind of federation of trade unions. And I can't say that we see remarkable differences, not at this stage of the study. And the public sector, I'm a bit ambivalent about the public sector agreements. I think they made too many concessions for the workers, but I do say that's where there were structural differences in terms of the state succeeded for the first time to get from the trade union permission for much more flexibility, the kind that the trade union resisted in the past. And this is, I think, a breakthrough for the state in these agreements. I'm generally, I can say, somehow detached from this study. I'm very fond of sectoral bargaining. And while I studied enterprise bargaining for the last few years, I think it's a lot of excitement about something that I'm not sure where innovation will come from. I think that the sectoral has more potential, and particularly for the future of work, where work patterns are going to be much less stable than they were ever before. So I'm not surprised to see that something really interesting happened when you have a concentration of a whole lot of high-level economists and stuff, but then also you have very little mobilization of the people who are covered by these agreements. And that's something that you have to bear in mind because it keeps the membership passive and it keeps the identification with the labor movement on very low flames. So that would be my thoughts on the trade-offs here. Lilach, if you want to add something before we move to the next paper?
No, I think let's move to that.
Okay. So first of all, thank you. And thank you for listening, and thank you for getting us, the two of us, together into this project and mobilizing us to actually get going, because we have to finish in the summer. Sean and Jenny, I asked Sean if you can introduce yourselves and how your paper fits into your project. So why won't we hand it over to you, Sean?
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah. So I am Sean O'Brady at the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University. I study collective bargaining and job quality and service work. And the big project I'm on now is with Jenny on the politics of technological change. Jenny and I are looking at how technologies are transforming work in contact centers across Canada, Germany, and the United States. And we also are working with Ines Wagner in Norway, who's extending our research to the Norwegian context. And so it's not only looking at how technologies are transforming work, but also what unions can do about it and how institutions matter. And I guess, Jenny, since you're here, you might want to maybe just quick introduction, but even though everybody knows you.
Hi, I'm Jenny Doellgast, and yeah, I think Sean said everything about our project. I'm in Germany right now doing some of the field research. So Sean's going to present the paper, but I will be in the background to answer questions.
Okay, great. And I'll provide you with a bit more context too, because I actually have a slide on the research context that's part of the presentation. So our presentation is called Collective Responses to Work from Home During the Pandemic. We're comparing contact centers in Canada, Germany, and the United States. And basically, in terms of the background, the transformative technologies and public health mandates are leading workplaces in Canada. Oh, I wrote in Canada there because I did it in Canada initially, but in Canada and across the world to introduce work from home. Work from home provides workers with flexibility, but research finds this flexibility can be both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, flexibility can be a good thing, right? You get to work from home, you get to have more work-life balance, you don't have to change your pants, you get to reduce commute times, you get to go tend to issues of importance in the home when you're on breaks. And so employees tend to like it, and it can be a good thing. But it can also be a very bad thing in some ways too. You can have reduced control over your work because managers can exercise certain types of power at a distance, and I'll talk more about that later. You can have poor mental health. For example, you have less management supervision, less support from your colleagues, so it can create a very strange work environment. And so where we come in is we say, okay, it's important to understand how work from home is affecting workers, but we want to understand how the role of unions. What do unions do? How do unions impact these relationships? How do they impact the adoption of work from home? And how do they impact how work from home affects workers? And on top of that, how do institutions, meaning industrial relations institutions, how do they mediate the effects of voice across country contexts? So the outline of our argument, we look at 3 country contexts, and we look at contact centers. Now, the idea of contact centers, some of you may ask what it is. It's essentially call centers, but now we're moving to people are moving to the term contact centers because it's about more than taking calls. You're not just taking calls, there's more instant messaging happening, right? Customer service agents are answering customer queries by chat. They're engaging in email. Sometimes they're even on social media. So the term contact centers has come into vogue. And why we look at a single industry is the fact that if you look at, the industry has many similarities across countries, but if we look at dynamics across countries, we can isolate the impacts of what unions do and industrial relations institutions, how they matter. And overall, our argument is we look at 3 different countries, but we argue that one country, Germany, stands out from the others. We look at them in unionized contexts, whether it's collective bargaining, but Germany has more than collective bargaining. Germany has strong co-determination rights. The workers have strong co-determination rights, which include consultation rights and veto powers, which enables workers to exercise more influence over work from home and introduce more positive forms of flexibility associated with it. The absence of similar rights of co-determination rights in Canada and the United States led to more negative forms of flexibility. What do we mean by flexibility? Well, there are three types of flexibility that we look at. One has to do with rights to work from home, meaning the location of your work. Do you have the right to work from home and to say, I don't want to work in the office, or vice versa? Another one has to do with task autonomy. If you're working from home, how autonomous are you really from your employer? Can you do things the way you want to do them in a way that's suitable for your mental health and well-being? And third, working hours. Does it enable you to have positive forms of working hour flexibility, or is it done in a way that's insensitive to your personal needs? So we look at these three forms of flexibility. And to unpack the argument a bit about why works councils are so important, there are three reasons. One has to do with they provide workers with consultation and veto rights over a broad range of practices of relevance to work from home. The legislation in Germany enables workers to exercise influence over management decisions relating to the introduction of artificial intelligence technologies, the site of location for work, the schedules that they introduce, and performance monitoring. And by veto rights, we mean that works counselors can actually say no. They could say, no, you can't introduce this, and then they have to go back to negotiating it. The second important feature is the fact that it reflects the temporal dimension of it. Contrary to collective bargaining, which tends to take, you wait several years and you negotiate as the collective agreement expires, works councils operate on a day-to-day basis, influencing decisions without collective action. So they don't have to get everybody together every few years to do something. You have to wait, and you have to hope that people can be mobilized. No, you can actually say, I'm going to consult on what management is doing when they're doing it, which makes it easier to resist issues like technology, as technologies are introduced all the time, right? Companies aren't necessarily waiting for the collective agreement to expire to introduce new technologies. And this was important for the context of remote work, which happened very fast. And the third would be that it gives workers access to information and expertise on new technology. And a special thing that, Ginny was interviewing a lot of works councils on this, and this surprised me, the extent of it, was that the works councils have rights to company-funded technology consultants. So if a new technology is being introduced, the works council can get the company to pay for a consultant to inform the works council on all the details of the technology as they negotiate it. So it prevents information asymmetries from being used against them in negotiating the adoption of new technologies. Quick statement, we've been looking at literature, we're contributing to knowledge and comparative employment relations, and how unions and institutions across different countries matter for tech adoption effects on workers. We have a whole lit review there, but I won't get too deeply in it. I just created this slide so that we can revisit this later if people have questions on how we contribute to the broader research, but I think there's a lot to say on our findings, so I will speed up to that. And to provide you with a bit more research context, I mentioned a bit of it earlier, but this is funded by Canadian grant. Initially, it was Canadian grants, 2 Canadian grants in Canada. We actually have more grants. The American Federation of Labor has just offered to give us, looks like they're going to be providing us with funding to support additional work on this. Current data, we have over 85 interviews. I don't have the exact count because I'm doing them day after day, and Ginny as well, but we have over 85 so far, and we're continuing to do more. Archival sources like collective agreements, works agreements, press releases, others. We have a number of companies across countries that we're looking at. We're doing further interviews spring.
Sean, I think Sean cut out.
I think we lost Sean.
Sean, are you there?
I guess he is there, but he's kind of
Yeah.
not totally with us.
Okay.
But we'll wait for a minute.
Well, I guess I can actually pick up here.
Okay.
Because I'm sure, yeah, this is basic stuff. So we are doing further interviews And then when he talks about the survey data, that's the next step. So we're working with the CWA, Communication Workers of America, on a survey. And that's actually what this AFL-CIO grant is for. It's the CWA applied for the grant, and they're working with us then to do this worker survey. And it's a second wave from another survey that we did with them in 2017 on performance management and the impacts on worker stress. We had a lot of other questions in there about, the particular technologies and workers' fears around unemployment and the like, associated with outsourcing and technology adoption. So we're updating that and including some more questions about the AI-based tech and the work from home experience to try to see how that has then impacted some of these questions of worker well-being. So, Sean, are you
Sean, you're on mute.
back?
Okay, I am back.
Yeah, he's back. He's back.
Okay.
My apologies. I was booted. And now some funky things are happening a little bit.
That's part of the work from home thing,
So I just finished talking about, the research.
Okay, great. So just I'll try to speed up some of it now because I lost a bit of time because of the internet. Just to provide you with context as to what's driving work from home. Work from home was driven by domestic public health mandates as the first one, lockdowns that prevented call center agents from going into the office, physical distancing requirements, which made it less practical to actually go in the office because when you have cubicles side by side, right, it became less feasible for you to send everybody in and have them all work in close quarters, so you couldn't use the current infrastructure to handle the calls that were coming in. Changes in consumer behavior as more people worked from home, that actually drove up call volumes, which added pressure for them to scale up. And it's difficult to scale up in the office to begin with when you have a growth of calls, which is why shifting to the internet was important. And instabilities in supply chains were also important. There were lockdowns in call centers across different countries, limiting a potential for offshoring, which meant that there had to be work from home was an important part of the solution to addressing new pressures and new demands for customer service. Just to note, it wasn't the only option. Chatbots and conversational AI were also introduced at a greater scale to kind of cut the flow coming in. And through this, there were divergences in work from home arrangements in the pandemic across countries. German workers had considerably more favorable forms of flexibility than their counterparts in Canada and the US. And if you mentioned before, I mentioned divergences in three areas: rights to work from home, task autonomy, and working hours. I'm going to talk about the broad differences across countries, but just note that there was some segmentation with the countries as well. Not everything was the same across the entire industry. There was differentiation on the basis of collective bargaining and which works council you had in some instances. The first, this is a sample of some of the companies and some of the rights that were available, and this shows you some contrast in rights to work from home. If you were, for example, in the unionized German firm that had a works council, you had a right to access work from home. You had a right to refuse working from home. You had a right to return to the office if it wasn't working out. You had a right to equipment reimbursement, and you had rights to company-funded tech consultants to be able to negotiate how it was done when it interacted with technology. If you were in a German subcontractor, you would have less rights, but you still had some rights, like the right to refusal and equipment reimbursement and company-funded tech consultants. And 3 of the union firms in North America that were examined, you only had the right to refusal. You didn't have any other rights in terms of work from home. And in terms of the non-union, well, you had none at all because you didn't have any representation. There's one small exception. Equipment reimbursement in some United States and some states in the US was mandated by law. So it might not have been mandated by collective bargaining, but it would have been mandated by law, which was interesting. So it depended on where you worked. Another thing was that task autonomy was improved to some extent in Germany, but less so in North America. Why was it improved in Germany? Well, if you worked from home, you didn't have, in Germany, you wouldn't have, your supervisor there watching you. But on top of that, the works councils, the works agreements prevent individual performance from being assessed. You have to have an aggregate of data from at least 5 employees for you to assess the performance of workers in Germany. So because of that, when somebody's working at home, you can't look at their metrics, their stats for each individual employee and tell them what to do. So there's some liberation there because there's distance from managers, but they can't look at your data. And there were also strict regulations in terms of the webcams. In Canada and the US, it wasn't true. It wasn't the same. Task autonomy was low because even though you worked from home, all the technologies just came with you. All the software to monitor your calls on an individual basis came with you. And they could do things like screen grabs, monitor your calls with your voice. Not much changed in terms of monitoring. But, work from home did provide them with distance from managers, and some of them still felt, some workers did express that they still felt like they had a bit more autonomy, but they weren't separated from the technology. And webcam monitoring was not strictly regulated in the North American companies at the point that I've examined, it. And just to give you actually one more interesting fact about it too, just to show you how bad things can get. And this was an example Ginny and I were talking. We were talking about this company called Teleperformance, which outsources, one of the companies we examined outsources work to them. They actually record video footage of workers to find out if they're actually at their stations. And if they leave their station, or if they're eating, or if they even have somebody do the work for them, the AI automatically takes a picture of them and sends it to their manager. So there's a lot of experimentation happening in North America, and there are some fears of to what extent it might be pushed on the unionized workplaces. And the third form of flexibility has to do with working time. Flexibility with respect to punctuality in the unionized firm, it wasn't very strong. Part of that is because if you cannot monitor individual workers and they're at home, you cannot detect whether or not they're leaving or coming from work on time. So they actually have a lot of freedom. Split shifts, which were, in the past seen as highly controversial, started to become more embraced, where somebody would stop to feed their child dinner and then go back to work. And ongoing consultation and veto powers over schedules and contact centers were there in Germany. In Canada and the US, there was no change in working time flexibility. It essentially became the same and highly managed by software. Explaining the outcomes across the two countries, I just have to make sure I'm leaving time for questions. In the North American countries, collective bargaining was there, but it was a narrow tool for addressing digital work. In the past, collective bargaining did not address many issues related to technology. In fact, the unions often resisted work from home before the pandemic, many of them, or ambivalent towards it. And this had to do with the fact that it made them worry that they'd lose power and access to members, and that grievances couldn't be effectively enforced, and they worried about it. There was an inability to negotiate new issues in a quickly evolving crisis. As the pandemic came, you had to open some collective agreements, but you didn't want people to lose their jobs or any sudden changes to really affect you. So it was all done, whatever side agreements were done quickly and were highly liberal. As work from home became widespread, union members started wanting it to be permanent. For example, a Canadian survey shows that 9 out of 10 members want work from home on a permanent basis, which has some union officials alarmed because they don't know. It's difficult for them to negotiate how effective to resist management abuse of work from home when workers on the same side probably won't strike for it or mobilize against it because they're asking for it, basically. So it creates some contradictory pressures. And managers increasingly embrace work from home. They love it in North America because evidence suggests it's associated with greater productivity, less absenteeism, and greater schedule adherence in these types of things. And the worker isolation that I mentioned is worker isolation and reduced capacity for collective action was also an issue. As everybody was at home, there was a reduction in grievances. Some people suggest that the commitment to the union went down. There were fracturing union member communications. Also worsened by fear of management retaliation. If you're working from home, since you have few rights to work from home in North America, workers don't want to rock the boat. because if they rock the boat, they're scared that management will bring them all into the office. And so they don't want to strike over this stuff. They don't want anything bad to happen because they're really cherishing work from home, even though it might have questionable implications for worker power in the future and their ability to have certain forms of security. In Germany, the outcomes were a bit different. The Works Constitution Act provides them with strong rights over influence to work from home, and this has historically been the case. And so they actually started negotiating work from home before the pandemic because it was seen as somewhat less controversial. For example, there was a works agreement in 2016 that was introduced around work from home, providing many rights, including the rights that I mentioned earlier. And there was even a 10-month pilot in 2019 prior to work from home, where they concluded that it went pretty well with over 1,000 participants. The union was favorable to work from home because they don't see it as having the same threats because they have co-determination rights to influence it. Worker isolation is a concern for collective bargaining, though. Union members in Germany, union officials in Germany did demonstrate concerns about not having access to members, but Works Council powers were largely unaffected because this doesn't require collective action. It requires the exercise of authority from the Works Council and directly influencing management decisions. And management retaliation in exchange for work from home, my understanding is it wasn't as much of an issue. Jenny might speak to that more because she actually headed the German data collection. And the German major telecom firm that we studied was interested in bringing workers back because they were worried that they didn't have enough control over workers and that there'd be productivity issues. And they're talking about potential compromises. Final slide almost, we're coming to an end. In fact, the Works Council's, the Works Council Modernization Act actually strengthened Works Council powers over this. It specifically refers to work from home, gives Works Councils the clear ability to function remotely and to carry out their activities without having to be physically present because that was unclear, and also makes company-funded consultants clear in the legislation. Some of these rights were there before, but the fact that the legislation clearly enunciates it gives it more power. So there's actually, when you talk about institutional drift, this is institutional maintenance, right? So what does this tell us? This tells us that flexibility outcomes from technological change are embedded in their institutional environments. It's not only a question of worker militancy, but institutions matter. And I won't get, I've consumed a lot of time because I lost the internet in the middle. So I'll just say, we do talk a bit about the importance of joint technology committees to inform the North American people, our North American colleagues, as a potential option, a substitute for works councils, where you can have a new structure which enables employees to exercise influence over tech adoption, and which would be more suitable for threats from technology. And that's it.
Cool. Lilach, Carla, do you have questions?
Yes, can I?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question and a comment. So first of all, it was really, really interesting, and I would love to read it when it's, I don't know, when you can send it. And I think it's also a relevant guide to our study. A question and then a comment. A question, I was wondering, what are the differences between Germany and North America? There are probably a lot of differences regarding the way the country and the population looked at the pandemic. I mean, did people go back to the offices at the same time in Germany and in North America? I know that there are differences between North America and Israel, probably also regarding the pandemic, how people were afraid from the pandemic. So this is the question, and did it influence or did not influence your study? And the second, it's just a comment. In our study, we found one interesting collective agreement with innovative approach to work at home, and it was of a German company. There was really a right to work from home, something very, very different of all the collective agreements we found in the private sector in Israel. And I think it's really your study provides the reason. Thank you again for that presentation.
Carla, or if you have questions.
Yeah, if I may ask something
Sean, can you
additional.
take the slides down just so we can see people better?
I was very interested about the composition of the workforce in the contact centers that you have studied so far. If they are similar, different, if they are structured more by by a young workforce or not. And I was wondering if these new conditions have pushed organizations to look to outsource more these services and try to look for tertiarizing or outsourcing these services to third world countries.
Okay, thank you. I'll put in 2 more questions and then hand it over to you. Three things actually. First, methodologically, you're looking within the organized sector. And I think that's one of the challenges that we're facing in our study. You're looking at collective bargaining practices in North America and works council agreements in Germany. What about the comparison between them and those who are outside the collective loop? I don't remember what's the share of companies with works councils in Germany. It's not as high as we would like it to be. So is there an impact between the collective, between the organized sectors and those that are not? Second, I was thinking in the theoretical framing of this, it really resonates with the traditional flexibility debate. Is this an employers-driven flexibility or a workers-driven flexibility? Both may have an interest in work from home, but for different reasons and with different rules and institutions. So while everyone is fond of flexibility, it's very different things that they're fond of. And if you can actually, do you see if there is a difference in the way that the debate on work from home is being framed today than the way it was framed, the flexibility debate was framed over the last few decades? And the third thing is, I think that I would like to see more of a general kind of reference to general differences between the North American and German, and particularly I thought about this in the context of privacy, or what you put in autonomy. You know, Germany is bound by the GDPR and a totally different concept of privacy than what you have in North America. So things that are totally legit in North America are not in Germany, regardless of work from home. So I think that it's also institutions matter, but also legal culture and human rights culture, the way are also aspects that frame the differences between the two regimes.
Okay, Sean, did you want to get started answering, or?
Yeah, sure, yeah. So,
I'm taking our time and I'm not shutting the curtain here as they're doing in the Zoom, because it's just us. So, you know, take as much time as you want, I think.
and there was just one question before I begin that I'm not sure if I 100% got it, because Ginny asked me to close these slides and then I got sidetracked. Carla, you mentioned, I think you were asking something about differentiation across works councils, but I'm not sure if I understood whether every works council was different, or was it something else?
It was.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I made a couple of questions about, was thinking about the composition of the workforce and whether there was, under these new conditions, a push to outsource or tertiarize these services of contact centers abroad in developing countries or similar.
Oh, okay. I thought there was another question before, but I guess it just wasn't a question. It's a good thing I asked. Okay, or else I would have answered a question to nobody. Okay, great. Yeah, so in terms of the question, the differences between Germany and North America, whether people went back to the office at the same time, how it was perceived by people, I suspect that one I might end up punting a little bit more to Ginny, because Ginny's done some of the North American, she's done some of the US research with me, but she's done all of the German research. So I'm not sure I get a sense of how, whether these perceptions are different. And then we also have questions of whether they were back at the office at the same time. What, you know, obviously these are not 100% the same, but I saw the ebbs and flows as being somewhat similar. And I don't think Ginny and I have completely compared across the 3 countries the timing, exact timing, and that could be good to do. But we haven't gone into that type of precision yet to say, okay, this is when the lockdown happened here or not. Go ahead, Ginny.
I mean, I could just say a big difference is that there were really lockdowns, and there were very clear rules about them in Germany. I don't know the rules in Canada, but in the US, there was much more of a dynamic of unions negotiating over workers being able to go and a home, where there was a lot of differences just across workplaces, that some contact centers that were non-union required a lot of their workers to stay in the office. And then they had public health, they had health problems, and people were getting sick, and there were some things on the news. So, I mean, I wrote a kind of blog thing about this at the beginning of the pandemic, about how great it was, that there's a CWA, and you actually had this nice way that you could negotiate this process of protecting the workers. Which was a big thing they could provide their members, like actually have a structure of rules and a set of conditions around going home. So I think Sean presented it as like the US is worse than Germany, but you could also say, compared to the subcontractors, right, it was much better, that they had a much more regulated, understandable process that did protect the workers quite a bit. And then in Germany, basically 85% of the workers went to work from home during the first sort of wave of lockdowns, where it was more of a national set of rules about workers who could work from home had to do that. And under those conditions, it was just like from one day to the other, they moved a huge proportion of like managerial German workforce. And still, the last interviews I was doing, there was like a light lockdown, but still it was expected that most workers who could work from home were doing that. And so it was at 85% of the call center workforce was work from home. And the employer made accommodation for people who, for different kinds of family reasons or they had some reason why they preferred to work in the office, and they could choose to do so. So I think that kind of answers the technical part of the question.
Yeah, and I guess
I guess the question of the influence on the study is that's part of the whole, right? If we were to tell a more detailed picture, that's part of the context. Certainly the national context of the lockdowns makes a difference, but also you'd say the similarity in both cases is that having a union did provide some framework for something that was happening to happen in a more sort of orderly, protected way compared to the general population, perhaps in their country.
And I guess one small fact about Canada in that question is Canada was very, very rigid in terms of work from home. Almost everybody had to work from home during the lockdown. So there was nobody in the office at all. And so that was very, very enforced, and it was less loose than the United States. There was a question about the organized versus the unorganized sectors. We've actually done a few interviews with people in non-union settings, and basically, they were no better. That you didn't have a collective agreement, right? So in North America, in the non-union settings, you didn't even have the basic rights to work from home. Basic rights, all the privileges in a collective agreement, scheduling, limits to performance monitoring, all of that was not even there. So the US unionized group wasn't the protections weren't nearly as strong as in Germany, but they were definitely stronger than the non-unionized sector. And we know that from the limited number of interviews we've had. We haven't been able to get the non-union companies as much as we'd like, though, just because they're so tough to get access to. We're getting access through the unions who are giving us the access to their members, but we're not able to get the non-union groups to the extent that we'd like. There was a discussion a bit about how flexibility is framed today versus the last few decades. I guess that's a good question. In terms of the union debate, right? That type of flexibility was seen negatively in the United States, working from home. I just discussed a bit how the union members were kind of worried about it, and they didn't want to go there because they were worried about what it would mean for organizing and for contacts with others. And in Canada, I'd say the dynamics are similar.
I think one way that we see in our agreements that it's possible to work out with this is we are talking about the right to work from home, and there is also the duty to work from home, and there's also the right of management to call you back from home into the office. So you have, if you play with the right and duty and who's right and who's duty, then you can kind of highlight the various notions of flexibility. I think they're kicking us out gently,
Yep.
in a way, you know, kind of nudging us. So we may have to call it a day, and hopefully keep in touch about this and see where we're going with our projects.
Ashley, I'm gonna make you
Oh, that would be great. And
Okay.
Sassy, are you going
And
to that?
Sassy. So let's coordinate for a drink in Sase, and we'll take it from there. Okay, Carla, nice meeting you. Thanks for joining.
Nice meeting you. Thank you.
And seeing you, nice seeing you, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, if you know how to run spotlights, you're more than welcome to. And then Ashley, the other thing that we ask is that you hit record to the cloud before you start your introductions. Okay. Okay. If you don't, we will hit it after you start, but it'll be a little bit of a messy introduction, and then you'll have that flash across your screen. Okay. I'll hit record. I'll go yeah, you have a couple minutes. All right, you all set? Yeah, so I'm gonna start spotlighting. Perfect. Have a great session. Thank you.